One moment they were planning dinner, and the next, everything he thought was stable cracked beneath his feet. She told him, with calm finality, that she didn't love him anymore. No drama, no shouting, just the brutal simplicity of detachment. He didn't react, didn't plead. He stood there as she picked up her things and left, like it was an errand, like it was ordinary. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was louder than anything Trent had ever experienced. He didn't cry. He didn't move. The tea kettle whistled on the stove, forgotten. The air in the room felt thinner, colder, like it didn't belong to him anymore. The absence of her was immediate and total, and it filled the apartment in a way her presence hadn't for months. Trent walked through the apartment, touching things he hadn't noticed in weeks. The photo frames, the folded blanket, the fridge magnets. They all felt like props now, part of life that had abruptly ended. He sat on the edge of the couch, unmoving, his hands clenched in his lap. Not from rage. He wasn't even sure what he felt. Hollow, maybe, like he'd been emptied. He tried to think, tried to pinpoint the moment things had started falling apart. But there were no signs. Or maybe there were, and he just didn't want to see them. Time passed in silence. The sun dipped lower. The city lights outside flickered on. But inside, nothing changed. Trent remained in the same spot, stuck between disbelief and dread. Then came a knock. 3 soft taps on the door. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to explain, but the silence was growing unbearable, and the sound of a human voice, even just a greeting, suddenly felt like the only thing that might tether him to the present. He opened the door. Jason from next door stood there, hoodie half-zipped, keys in one hand, and concern in his eyes. He didn't look shocked, didn't tilt his head or say he was sorry. He just asked if Trent was all right. Trent didn't pretend. He said she'd left, said it was over. Jason nodded, asked if he wanted company. Trent stepped aside. They sat in the living room. Jason didn't speak right away. He looked comfortable with the quiet, which was strange but welcome. Trent appreciated that more than he expected. There was no pressure to perform grief. No need to say the right words. Eventually, Trent spoke, told him he felt like the floor had opened under him, like he was falling but not moving. Jason said he understood, that sometimes losing something you thought was permanent could leave you feeling directionless. They didn't go into details. They watched a documentary neither of them paid attention to. The background noise helped. It wasn't a solution, just a small relief. When Jason stood to leave, he told Trent he was around if he needed anything, that no one should have to go through something like that completely alone. That night, Trent didn't sleep, but the suffocating loneliness had dulled, just slightly, enough to make it to the next day. He kept moving, teaching, smiling when necessary, nodding through conversations. But it was all on autopilot, the kind of numb that becomes routine before you even realize it. Every night, the apartment greeted him with the same stillness. He found himself pausing at the wall they shared, listening, unintentionally, for signs of life next door. 3 days later, Jason texted him, just checking in. No pressure. Trent stared at the message for a long time, then typed thanks, deleted it, rewrote it as appreciated, deleted that too. Eventually, he just sent, thanks. Jason replied in less than a minute. Anytime. Followed by, want to grab some food? Trent hesitated, then said yes. They walked 2 blocks to a small Thai place, ate in relative silence, only speaking when something was worth saying. Jason told a ridiculous story about his childhood cat stealing pancakes. Trent laughed, and the sound startled him. It felt strange coming out of his mouth again. After dinner, they walked home slowly. No rush, no awkwardness. In the days that followed, Jason kept showing up. Not constantly, just when it mattered. Sometimes he brought tea, sometimes a movie recommendation, sometimes nothing at all. They never talked about the breakup directly again. But the weight of it hung between them in the most honest way, acknowledged through silence, through shared space. One night, Trent said he felt like a failure. Jason asked at what? Trent didn't know how to answer. At love? At being enough? At holding on to something? Jason said sometimes it's not about failing. Sometimes it's just about not fitting anymore. And that isn't anyone's fault. The words didn't fix everything, but they helped. Trent didn't know where any of this was going. He didn't try to name what he was feeling. He just knew that Jason made the days more bearable. And that mattered. He was still figuring things out, still questioning what came next. But the idea of starting over didn't feel so terrifying anymore. Because this time, he wasn't starting alone. Trent didn't know when it had started feeling normal. The quiet knocks at his door, the easy rhythm of evenings spent not thinking too hard. At some point, Jason had become part of the silence Trent didn't fear. There were no expectations, no conversations about what any of it meant. Jason just showed up sometimes, and Trent let him in. They didn't plan the nights. Sometimes it was a movie neither of them really watched. Other times, they just sat on opposite ends of the couch with the low hum of background sound filling the spaces where pain used to sit. It wasn't avoidance. It was something else, a kind of rebuilding that didn't need instructions. Trent was still figuring out how to talk again. Not the surface kind of talking. He did plenty of that at work, but the real kind. The kind that required letting someone see the parts you weren't proud of. One night, after a long pause between sips of tea, he said he hadn't been sleeping well. Not since it happened. He didn't name her. Didn't have to. Jason nodded slowly, like he already knew. I just keep running everything back in my head, Trent admitted. Like maybe if I replay it enough, I'll see what I missed. Jason didn't tell him to stop. Didn't say it was unhealthy. He just asked, and do you? Trent shook his head. Not really. Maybe I just wasn't looking in the right places. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. Jason didn't push for more. He only said, we see what we can handle. Sometimes that's not the truth. It sat with Trent for a long moment. A sentence that didn't feel like advice. More like permission to stop blaming himself for not noticing the crack sooner. They went back to the movie. Neither of them commented on how little sense it made. It didn't matter. It gave their minds something to do while their bodies stayed still. On another evening, they walked. The streets were wet from a light rain that had just passed, and the night air felt clean. Not refreshing, just present. They didn't talk much during the walk, but Trent found himself paying attention to the way Jason matched his pace. How he didn't fill the space with words unless Trent did first. Eventually, Trent said, do you ever feel like everyone else knows who they are except you? Jason kept his eyes ahead. Sure. Trent looked sideways at him. Even now, Jason's voice was quiet. Especially now. That answer stuck with Trent more than he expected. The next day, Trent came home to find a small paper bag hanging on his door handle. Inside was a muffin and a sticky note with just 2 words. Keep going. He didn't know why it hit him the way it did. Maybe because it was simple. Maybe because it was specific enough to feel like someone had noticed he was still trying. That night, he texted Jason. You around? Less than a minute passed. Yeah. Jason didn't even knock. Just stepped inside like he'd always belonged there. They didn't sit apart this time. Trent didn't even notice when he started leaning closer, just slightly, as if proximity might make the room feel less hollow. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular when he said, I've been feeling off, like I'm walking through fog, and every time I think I'm out, it just moves with me. Jason didn't flinch at the vulnerability. You don't need to be out of it yet, he said. You just need to keep moving. Trent looked down at his hands. I don't know what I'm moving toward. Maybe not knowing is part of it. Jason didn't speak again after that. He let the conversation settle. They went back to watching the screen, but Trent wasn't really paying attention anymore. The fog was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. Later that night, Trent stood at the door as Jason put his shoes on. I don't always know how to talk about things, he said. Jason gave a small smile. You don't have to. You're doing fine. It was the first time in weeks Trent didn't question if he really was. They settled into a rhythm. Some nights, they didn't say more than a few words. Others were filled with half-thoughts and quiet stories from old lives. Jobs they'd quit, decisions they regretted, people they missed but never contacted. Trent started looking forward to those hours more than he admitted to himself. One evening, when Jason asked if he wanted to watch something, Trent surprised himself by saying, not really. Jason nodded. All right. They sat in silence. Then Trent said, I don't really know who I am without her. Jason waited a second before responding. Maybe now you get to find out. Trent leaned his head back and exhaled. That terrifies me. Jason didn't try to reframe it. He just said, makes sense. The honesty of that answer broke something loose inside Trent. Not because it was deep or dramatic, but because it didn't ask him to be brave when he wasn't ready. Later, when the lights were dim and the credits rolled on something they didn't watch, Trent turned to him. I keep waiting to feel normal again. Jason shifted slightly, but didn't look away. I don't think you're meant to feel the same again, he said. You're not the same person anymore. Trent nodded slowly. Feels like I lost something important. You did. Trent looked over at him. And what if I don't know how to fill that space? Jason said, you don't fill it. You live around it. Eventually, it becomes part of your story, not the whole thing. There was something freeing in that. Like he didn't have to repair himself to be worth something again. They didn't linger on the moment. Trent stood and walked Jason to the door. Thanks, he said. For what? Being here. Jason looked at him with the kind of expression that didn't need translating. Always. When he left, the apartment didn't feel smaller. It didn't feel bigger either. Just real. Trent stood in the middle of the room, letting the quiet settle. For once, he didn't mind it. The following week was harder. Something about the routine of returning to work, pretending everything was okay, started wearing on him. One night, after grading papers for hours and getting nowhere, he sent Jason a message. Just need a pause. 15 minutes later, Jason was at his door with 2 bottles of sparkling water and a deck of cards. They played in silence. No scoreboard. No jokes. Just the soft sounds of shuffling and the occasional draw. Midway through the 3rd round, Trent said, sometimes I feel like I'm disappointing everyone, even when they don't say it. Jason didn't counter the thought, just placed his card down and said, people don't say a lot of things. The sentence sat between them like a shared truth. Trent let out a breath. I'm tired of pretending I'm fine. Jason responded, You don't have to pretend with me. It wasn't dramatic, but it was exactly what he needed. That night, as Jason got up to leave, Trent walked him to the door again. He didn't know why he did it, maybe habit, but he reached out and gently touched Jason's arm. I'm glad you're around, he said, the words heavier than they sounded. Jason looked at him. Me too. No deeper meaning. No promises. Just two people who had found something quietly steady in the middle of personal storms. By the end of the month, Trent realized he was no longer waking up with the same dread in his chest. He was still uncertain, still questioning, but something had shifted. He didn't feel like he was disappearing anymore, because someone kept showing up, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of finding himself again. For a while, things felt stable. Not perfect, not whole, but like something resembling a foundation was being built. Trent had allowed someone in. Not completely, but enough to feel less alone. Jason was there when it counted. They shared silence, laughter, unspoken thoughts. And somehow, it had become a ritual that mattered more than either of them admitted out loud. But nothing stayed simple forever. It started small. Missed messages, shorter replies, a shift in tone. Trent found himself hesitating to answer Jason's texts, even when he had nothing better to do. He began declining offers to hang out, blaming work or exhaustion. Jason didn't push. He just responded with understanding. Let me know if you need anything. Here if you want to talk. No pressure. Trent read those words and felt the exact opposite of comfort. Because something was building inside him, a tension he couldn't name. Not discomfort around Jason. Not regret. But something quieter and harder to shake. Uncertainty. Not about Jason. About himself. He didn't know how to navigate what they were building. He didn't know how to categorize it. Or if he should. Every time they sat too close, every time Jason's hand brushed his by accident, and neither of them moved away, Trent felt something stir. And that scared him. Not because he thought it was wrong. Because he didn't know what it meant. He'd spent most of his adult life following script. Education, career, long-term relationship with a woman. Predictable. Acceptable. Understood. But this? There was no script. One evening, Jason knocked. A familiar rhythm Trent had come to expect. But this time, Trent didn't answer. He stood just out of sight, holding his breath like that could make him invisible. After a minute, the knocking stopped. Jason left without saying a word. Trent felt the weight of that silence, more than he expected. The next morning, Jason sent a message. Hope you're okay. I won't keep knocking. Just wanted to check in. Trent didn't reply. Not because he was angry. He wasn't. He was afraid of leading Jason somewhere he wasn't ready to follow. Days passed. The distance grew. He buried himself in work, stayed later at school, volunteered for things he usually avoided. Anything to avoid the quiet apartment. Anything to avoid the wall they shared. But distraction only worked for so long. And when the weekend hit, the silence returned in full force. Saturday night, Trent sat on the couch with his phone in his lap. Jason's name sat at the top of the screen. No new message. Just the last one. Still unread. Still heavy. He hovered over the keyboard. Typed. Hey. Deleted it. Typed again. Sorry I've been distant. Deleted that too. He locked the screen and set the phone face down on the table. But even then, Jason didn't text again. And that hurt in a way Trent hadn't expected. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't anger. It was patience. Jason wasn't chasing him. He was letting Trent figure things out, even if that meant doing it alone. And Trent hated how much that made him feel seen. That night, he dreamt about the conversation they hadn't had. Jason sitting on the edge of the couch, asking gently, "What are you so afraid of?" And Trent answering honestly, not knowing. He woke up before sunrise, his chest tight, mind spinning. He sat up, pulled on a hoodie, and went for a walk even though the city was still asleep. He wasn't angry with Jason. Wasn't avoiding him out of guilt. It was fear, raw and shapeless. The kind that lives beneath the surface. Fear of changing. Fear of not being who he thought he was. Fear of wanting something he didn't know how to want. By Monday, he still hadn't said anything. When he passed Jason in the hallway, it was brief. Jason smiled politely, asked how work was. Trent gave a generic answer. But didn't stop walking. Neither did. That brief moment felt like 1,000 things unsaid. On Wednesday, he opened a message from Jason that had been sitting in his inbox since the weekend. There were no expectations in it. No frustration. Just one sentence. Still here, if you need a friend. It was the word friend that hit hardest. Because Trent didn't know what they were anymore. He missed him. Not in a possessive way. Not romantically, but deeply. He missed the way Jason looked at him like he wasn't broken. He missed being able to say nothing and still feel heard. And yet, he still didn't know how to go back. Or forward. So he stayed still. Until one night, sitting in the dark, he said aloud to no one, "I don't know who I am right now." The sound of his own voice startled him. But it was true. He was scared. Not of Jason. Not of being close. But of what it would mean to be vulnerable. To make space for a version of himself that didn't fit into any box he'd known before. He didn't want to mislead Jason. He didn't want to make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't want to run either. but his silence had already become a form of retreat. The next day, he wrote a message but didn't send it. I don't know what I'm feeling. I just know it matters. Then he changed it. I miss talking to you. I miss how easy it felt. Then deleted the whole thing and closed his phone again. That evening, after pacing the apartment for hours, he finally walked to Jason's door. Stood there, fist raised, then lowered, raised again. He knocked once. Quiet, almost hesitant. Jason opened the door. No surprise on his face. Just a soft question. Hey. Trent looked down, then back up. I've been trying to figure things out, he said, and I'm still not there. But I didn't want to disappear. Jason didn't say, it's okay. He didn't say, I understand. He just stepped back and opened the door wider. Trent walked in. They sat. The silence returned, but it wasn't cold this time. I've been scared, Trent admitted. Not because anything's wrong, but because I don't know what comes next. Jason gave a small nod. You don't have to know. Trent exhaled. That was all he needed to hear. They didn't talk much after that, but the silence wasn't avoidance. It was safety. Jason never asked for a label, never asked Trent to define the feeling. He just sat there, next to him, making space. And Trent realized, pulling away hadn't protected him. It had only kept him from something real. This time, he didn't run. Trent stood in front of Jason's door longer than he expected to. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wasn't sure he was ready to say it out loud. When the door opened, Jason didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside, letting him in with a slight nod, the kind that didn't demand explanation. Trent walked past him and sat down, not really sure where the conversation would begin, only knowing it had to. They sat side by side, not close enough to suggest anything had changed between them, but not so far that it felt like distance. The air between them held no pressure. It was a space open enough for honesty if he was willing to let it out. Without much build-up, Trent started speaking. He admitted he had thought that taking space would help him gain clarity, that disconnecting would give him answers. But instead, the silence had only made the questions louder. His voice didn't crack. He didn't dress it in apology. He just said it plainly, like facts that had waited long enough to be shared. Jason didn't interrupt or offer immediate comfort. He simply listened, absorbing the words like someone who understood the weight they carried. When he finally responded, it was with quiet ease. He hadn't expected Trent to return with conclusions. Only truth. Trent told him how he'd felt stuck between needing room to breathe and not wanting to lose the only person who'd made the uncertainty feel bearable. He explained that he hadn't stepped away because something felt wrong, but because everything felt unfamiliar, and that unfamiliarity had scared him more than he was willing to admit. Jason, still calm, assured him that he'd never needed perfection or clarity. What mattered more was showing up, and that Trent was doing that now. He wasn't trying to be reassuring for the sake of it. It was simply how he saw things. As the conversation unfolded, Trent found himself speaking more freely. He said he still didn't know where he was heading, that he was tired of pretending everything was fine when he was still trying to understand what this chapter of his life even meant. He wasn't searching for labels, just trying to understand himself in a world that suddenly looked different. Jason didn't fill the room with platitudes. He said it made sense to feel that way. He reminded Trent that not knowing wasn't failure. It was the first step of any honest path. They spoke without hesitation after that. No raised voices, no dramatics. Just two men trying to untangle the quiet questions that had settled in their lives. Trent said he was afraid of leading Jason on, that his silence had come from not knowing how to navigate feelings that didn't fit into neat categories. He admitted he was scared not because he thought he was doing something wrong, but because he was beginning to care, and that made things real. Jason didn't react with tension or disappointment. He simply nodded and said he hadn't expected anything more than sincerity, and that, despite the pause between them, his care hadn't disappeared either. As the evening deepened, the words came easier. Trent wasn't looking for permission, and Jason wasn't offering instruction. They were just speaking, openly, honestly, and with full awareness that this wasn't about resolving everything in one night. There was a moment when neither of them spoke, and for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like understanding. Trent admitted that despite everything, he didn't want to retreat again. That while he couldn't make promises about where things were going, he knew he didn't want to keep building walls between them. He wasn't looking for guarantees, only the space to keep figuring things out, without shame, without pressure. Jason accepted that without question. He said that if Trent wanted to take things one step at a time, he'd walk beside him, without needing to know the destination. When Trent finally stood to leave, the tension he'd carried with him felt lighter. He looked at Jason and said, without embellishment, that he was grateful, not just for the patience, but for not walking away when he had every reason to. Jason replied that he hadn't seen it as walking away. He'd just been holding the door open, waiting for the moment Trent was ready to walk back through it. That final exchange didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like the beginning of something built on mutual respect, not pressure, on quiet honesty, not forced answers. That night, as Trent stepped back into his apartment, He didn't feel cured or sure of anything. But for the first time in a long while, he felt grounded. Not by certainty, but by connection, steady, unforced, and real. The days that followed weren't filled with revelations or sudden changes. There was no defining moment. No switch flipped. Just small, steady steps towards something neither of them tried to name. Trent and Jason didn't meet every night, but the space between visits no longer felt uncertain. When they did see each other, the energy was different, less cautious, more grounded. One evening, as they sat at the table with mugs in hand, Jason asked how Trent had been sleeping. Better, Trent said. Not perfect, but I don't lie awake spinning anymore. Jason nodded and didn't press further. They let the moment pass, naturally. Trent eventually broke the quiet. He said he'd spent too long measuring himself against some invisible version of who he was supposed to be, and that lately, he was learning to let go of that. Not fully, not easily, but enough to notice the shift. Jason replied that figuring out who you are isn't something you ever finish. It's more like tending to something alive. You keep checking in, seeing what's changed, what still fits. They agreed to avoid rushing anything. Trent made it clear he still didn't know what this meant, what they were building, or where it might lead. Jason responded that he didn't need a roadmap, just the willingness to keep going forward, even when the path wasn't clear. They laughed quietly at that, not because it was funny, but because it was true, and somehow that made everything easier to carry. There are no more long silences weighted by doubt, only the kind that comes when two people don't need to fill the air to feel understood. One afternoon, while walking through a park near their building, Trent mentioned how exhausting it had been to always feel like he needed to explain himself to people. Jason said that maybe the real peace came not from finding someone who understood everything, but from being around someone who didn't ask for explanations at all. That stayed with Trent for days. They didn't use words like relationship, not because they avoided it, but because the moment didn't require it. What they were building wasn't about defining something for others. It was about building a space where both of them could breathe without fear of being misunderstood. Sometimes they talked about the past. Sometimes they didn't. They shared stories not to impress or confess, but simply to connect. Trent told Jason about the first time he froze up in front of a classroom. Jason shared how he once forgot his own address during a job interview. Neither story was profound. That wasn't the point. They weren't looking for depth. They were looking for real. Trent found himself thinking less about what Jason might want from him, and more about how much easier it was to simply be around him without performing. There was no need to hide the uncertainty or to pretend he was further along in some imagined emotional journey. It wasn't always smooth. Some days Trent pulled back, out of habit, not fear. He caught himself second-guessing his words, checking for signs he might be disappointing Jason somehow. But Jason never changed. He showed up with the same calm presence, the same steady way of being, the same quiet reminder. You don't need to be fixed to be cared for. One evening, after a slow meal and quiet walk, Trent looked at Jason and said, "I'm not used to this." "To what?" Jason asked. "To someone not needing me to be sure of anything." Jason didn't smile or look triumphant. He just said, "That's because I'm not here to collect answers. I'm here for the questions too." Trent didn't reply right away. He just nodded and felt something in his chest loosen. In the following weeks, they built a new rhythm. There was no pressure to see each other every day. But when they did, it mattered. Sometimes it was a shared podcast. Other times, it was quiet reading. One time, they spent nearly an hour debating which movies deserved second chances, and neither of them cared who won. Trent's world didn't shift dramatically, but expanded. He began reaching out to people again, not to explain anything, just to reconnect. He stopped avoiding places that reminded him of the past, not because they stopped hurting, but because they no longer defined him. Jason remained close, but never controlling, supportive but never demanding. He was simply consistent, and in that consistency, Trent found something he hadn't felt in a long time: stability without condition. One morning, over coffee, Trent asked, "Do you ever worry that not naming something makes it harder to protect?" Jason stirred his drink and replied, "I think naming it before it's ready can break it faster." They didn't need to say more. They both knew what they had. It didn't require labels. It required care. On a Sunday afternoon, they took a short drive to the coast. Neither of them brought up why. They just agreed that the weather felt like the kind that asked for movement. Walking side by side, Trent finally said, "I used to think vulnerability was something you offered as a gift, like a currency, earned or exchanged." Jason glanced at him. "And now I think maybe it's just about showing up without armor." Jason didn't speak. He didn't have to. They walked a bit further, and Trent added, "I'm not wearing all of it anymore." That night, back in their part of the city, Trent paused before stepping back into his apartment. He looked at Jason, unsure what he was about to say, but knowing it mattered. "I don't know what this will look like tomorrow, or a month from now," he began. Jason waited patiently. "But I didn't know I want to keep finding out with you." Jason nodded once. "That's more than enough." They didn't embrace. didn't seal the moment with anything dramatic. Just a quiet agreement between two people who had walked toward each other one step at a time, and would continue to do so, together.